Good evening, Adab, and on behalf of India Habitat Center, I welcome you to this evening session, translating Mir, learning from Mir by Ranjit Hoskote, poet, sarcasm, and culture Jubilee, presented in collaboration with Anjuman Tarafi Urdu and President India Habitat Center, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, also sends a warm wishes for the program. Unfortunately, not the prior commitment, she is unable to join in for this evening session. We would simply like to thank Mr. Sahitya has conceptualized this program. Parivartan is the IC publication where he contributed with an article on main subject of the session today. And I have also been asked by President India Habitat Center and Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee to welcome our two special guests, Mr. Ranjit Hoskote, Mr. Salman Khurshid, and they would like to felicitate you with the after the team.
Thank you everyone for joining this evening session. May I now invite Yasmin Rahman to come and take over. Thank you.
Adab, good evening everybody. Welcome everyone to the second edition of Adab Sarai, a platform for creative writers in Indian languages, and which is presented by the Anjuman Tarafi Urdu, which we popularly know as Urdu. It is our privilege that Ranjit Hoskote Sahab, he's a cultural theorist, poet, translator, curator. He's amongst us, and we will have the honor to launch his book, The Homeland and Ocean, published by Penguin. It's a masterful translation of 150 selected mashar of Mir Taqi Mir, and this entire year we will be celebrating Mir from the Anjuman. We started in January, I beg your pardon. So we started on 22nd January, and we had an event here at IIC. Then we had an entire festival dedicated to Mir from India International Center, and then we had the third event, the first edition of Adab Sarai, which we launched at Urdu. This event we had Jerry Pinto Sahab, Mustansi Delvi Sahab, Salman Khurshid Sahab, who is here today, Salim Salim Sahab, Chandravan Khayal Sahab, and they all shared their poetry and their works with us. This is our second edition, and this is completely dedicated to Ranjit Hoskote Sahab today. And I'm as eager as all of you to listen to him. I'll introduce my colleague Aisha, who will take the event forward. But before that, I would just like to say that we have planned 2 more editions. Next edition will be on the 14th of December at INC, and we will have Lata Pratak Shah with us, and we'll focus on Gujarati theatre. And we plan another session early next year, hopefully focusing on Bangla, and they are currently planning it. It's not final. We will share everything on Urdu. The handle, please go to Instagram and please do subscribe. Please to share all the things. And without much ado, I would like to invite Dr. Atul Fariki, who is the General Secretary of Anjuman Tarafi Urdu, and he will address you all in Urdu because finally we are a Urdu organization and we want that you listen to Dr. Fariki as well, and how he conceptualized this entire thing and how he convinced the Sahab to come. Thank you so much. And Dr. Atul Fariki is here. Yes. Thank you so much.
उधर बात ये उर्दू का था कि मैं आप लोगों को उर्दू में बोलना चाहती हूँ। मुझे ये सपना था कि इस तरह की आवाज आएगी, मुझे कहा कि इससे पहले का बात आगे मुझे सुनने इसलिए मैं उर्दू में आप सब लोगों को इस्तकबाल दूँ। रंजीत होस्कोटे साहब का, सलमान खुर्शीद साहब का, पार्टी साहब का आजमगढ़ से आएंगे। मुख्तसर मुझे ये बताना है कि अंजुमन तरक्की उर्दू के बारे में जो इस प्रोग्राम की करियर है आयशा रजी वो आपको बताएंगी। मैं कॉमरेड की बात की तरफ फिर आऊँगा और इस पर लैंग्वेज डिबेट हम फिर कभी करेंगे। और जब हम ये लैंग्वेज डिबेट करेंगे तो फिर हम CPI से ये पूछेंगे कि आपसे नंबर CCRT की बासी बात से खुदा का साझा के ऊपर क्यों डिबेट नहीं की, क्यों वो पार्टी से नहीं निकाला। मतलब वो आज की जो महफिल है वो होस्कोटे साहब की थी है, तो उनके लिए रहे तो वो ज्यादा बेहतर है। मतलब इस सवाल के बाद CPI के पास होगा नहीं। तो पहला मैं आप सब का इस्तेमाल करता हूँ। अंजुमन तरक्की उर्दू हिंद ने ये जो नया फोरम शुरू किया है, इसका नाम हमने अदब सराय रखा है। और इसका मकसद सिर्फ हिंदुस्तानी जबानों, जिससे हिंदुस्तानी अंग्रेजी भी शामिल है, के तख्लीकी अदब की नेटिव राइटिंग्स को प्रमोट करना है। अंजुमन की ये बिल्कुल क्लियर पॉलिसी जो शायद किसी और इदारे की नहीं है कि तमाम जुबानें हैं, कोई इलाकाई जुबान जिसे आप कहते हैं, या कि छोटी जुबानों को बहुत सारी बड़ी जुबानों ने अपने अंदर एप्रोप्रिएट कर दिया। मैं उस तरह नहीं कहना चाहता। खास तौर पर जो नॉर्थ इंडिया की जुबानें हैं, ब्रज, अवधी, हम लेकिन अंजुमन तरक्की उर्दू हिंद उन सब जबानों को इंडिपेंडेंट लैंग्वेज समझती है और हम सब के लिए कुछ ना कुछ करना चाहते हैं। मुझे जाती तौर पर मैंने इस प्रोग्राम के लिए बहुत कोशिश की और होस्कोटे साहब से मेरा दारोस एक मॉरिस के जरिए हुआ, और उससे ज़्यादा जो हमारे दोस्त थे जिनके साथ हमने तकरीबन 200 शोज किए, टॉम वॉल्टर साहब, उनके साथ हुआ। और वो बता ये था कि वो कुछ अंग्रेजी की नज़में पढ़ना चाहते थे, और जो नज़में हमने प्लान की थी उनको पढ़ने से पहले उन्होंने आपकी वो नज़म पढ़ी, और फिर उन्होंने मुझसे कहा कि मैं उस नज़म का तर्जुमा करूँ। मैंने उस नज़म का तर्जुमा करने की कोशिश की, एक ड्राफ्ट किया, वो वास्तु राइट आदमी है, आपने कुछ नहीं कहा, जो हमें पसंद नहीं आया। इसके बाद में 3-4 साल तक उसे गुनगुनाता रहा। खैर मैंने इसका तर्जुमा किया और मुझे लगता था कि वो ठीक किया। और जो अख्तर ईमान की मशहूर नज़म ट्रांसलेट स्टेशन का मुसाफिर, उसके लहन को पकड़ने की कोशिश की, मगर मैंने अपनी कॉलीग को दिया तो उन्होंने कहा नहीं यार ट्रांसलेट ट्रांसलेशन, मैंने उसको भी रिजेक्ट कर दिया। तो मेरा राय हमारे लिए खुशी की बात है कि आज आप हमारे दरमियान तशरीफ रखते हैं, मौजूद है। आखिरी बात मैं यह करना चाहता हूँ कि अंजुमन ने एक काम किया है जिससे शायद आप लोग वाकिफ नहीं होंगे, और वो ये है कि आज हम मीर तकी मीर की बात कर रहे हैं। उनकी जो ऑटोबायोग्राफी है जिक्र मीर, वो जब मैन्युस्क्रिप्ट से पहली दफ़ा किताब में तब्दील हुई तो मोस्ट अनफॉर्चुनेटली जिस ऑर्गेनाइजेशन ने उस किताब को छापा और जिसने आज रंजीत होस्कोटे साहब को यहाँ बुलाया है, जो तरक्की होती है, उसके उस वक्त के जनरल सेक्रेटरी ने उस हिस्से को सेंसर कर दिया। और अब तकरीबन 100 साल के बाद हमने उसको रिवाइव किया है, और यहाँ भी दोस्त बैठे हैं सदफ फाल्को, उन्होंने उसको ट्रांसलेट किया है, और अभी तक शायद 4 एडिशन हम उसकी छाप चुकी है। सबसे अहम बात यह है कि आज वैसे ज़्यादातर लोग और वाकिफ होंगे कि मीर के बारे में ये कहा जाता है कि वो निहायती एक्सेंट्रिक आदमी थे और उन्होंने दिल्ली से लेकर लखनऊ तक नहीं बोले वो। लेकिन अगर आप उस हिस्से को पढ़ें उनकी ऑटोबायोग्राफी के, तो वो सारा जो आपका तासुर है वो उसमें से खत्म हो जाए। और ख़ास तौर पर जो उस जमाने की सोसाइटी है उसके बारे में आपको इतनी इंसाइट्स मिलेंगी जो शायद कहीं और ना मिले। और एक बहुत सबसे अहम बात वही कि जितने लोगों ने काम किया है उनमें से किसी ने भी मीर और बेदी के रिश्ते के बारे में कोई बात नहीं की है। शायद उसके लिए जितनी मेहनत करनी चाहिए थी और नहीं की है। तो मीर और बेदी का क्या रिश्ता था और बेदी से भी कितने मुतासिर थे, इसका क्लू हमें सिर्फ जिक्र मीर को साथ हिस्से में मिलता है। तो रंजीत होस्कोटे साहब मैं आपका बहुत शुक्रगुजार हूँ। हमारे लाइफ ट्रस्टी सलमान खुशी साहब यहाँ बैठे हैं जिनकी वजह से अंजुमन की शक्ल बदल गई। और मैं आपसे दरख्वास्त करूँगा अगर आप दिल्ली में हैं और आपके पास 21-18 घंटे का वक्त हो तो आप अंजुमन तशरीफ लाएँ। आप भी जो लोग यहाँ मौजूद है आप लोग यहाँ तशरीफ लाएँ और देखें कि उनको भी अदारे कुछ बेहतर ठीक किए जा सकते हैं, वो बेहतर भी चल सकते हैं। मैं आप सबका शुक्रगुजार हूँ। और इसी के साथ में अपनी दोस्त आयशा रबी से दरख्वास्त करता हूँ कि वो तशरीफ लाएँ। उन्होंने इस प्रोग्राम के लिए बहुत मेहनत की है और मुझे ये खुशी है कि सरवर फारूकी साहब यहाँ तशरीफ रखे हैं, वो बहुत कम जलसों में जाते हैं, मगर उनकी आमद मेरे लिए ज़ाती तौर पर खुशी के बाइस है। बहुत शुक्रिया। और आप
तो अब इस प्रोग्राम का आगाज करते हुए I would like to invite Mr. Ranjit Hoskote, a distinguished Indian poet, cultural theorist, and artist, known for his profound contributions to contemporary literature and the arts. His poetry is celebrated for its lyrical intensity and philosophical depth, often explores themes of identity, memory, and history. Mr. Hoskote has published several acclaimed collections of poetry, including Jonahwhale and Icelight, a recipient of numerous honors, including the Sahitya Akademi Gold. He has also curated exhibitions and written extensively on art and culture. Mr. Hoskote's translation work, particularly his rendering of Kashmiri poet Lal Ded verses as Urdu poetry Mir Taqi Mir's ghazals in his book, The Homeland is the Ocean, which we will be talking and learning about today, has further cemented his reputation as a bridge between languages and culture. May I now please advise Mr. Hoskote. For the book launch, may I please also invite Mr. Mansi Shittal
and what?
and Mr. the editor of the book.
Let me begin by saying how deeply moved I am to see so many of you here this evening. From various parts of my own life in literature, translation, the visual arts, but also from the larger and lively and vibrant life of Urdu, the language, the literature, and the way in which it still ripples out and holds its own in this country and beyond. So it's very, very special to be launching this book under the auspices of the Anjuman Therapeutic, in which Mahatma Gandhi actually described as Urdu. It brings to us notions of hospitality, of belonging, of gathering, and I think these are values to which we feel summoned today at a point where there is so much that stands against those values by way of divisiveness. And this is something I would cherish. और इससे पहले कि मैं और कुछ कहना चाहूँ, I should thank you, Mr. Khurshid, as life trustee of this institution, Athar Farooqi Saab, who has been very, very gracious. He really downplayed himself when he spoke. It's actually been an honor that he translated a text of mine called The Last Annal of Alamgir, which is about an emperor who is not terribly popular today, but who I've been fascinated by endlessly. And that to and fro has been very, very interesting between Angrezi and Urdu and the other way. I also want to thank Aisha Najib and all of the people gathered under this particular banner. And I thought that I would also, as I go along, without, of course, forgetting to thank some long-suffering souls, my commissioning editor, Mutashi Mukherjee, and my copy editor, who's here, Aparna Abhijit. It's a reminder that to create a book is really an activity that involves a whole range of people. It's a community of friends, colleagues, and many, many people who are thanked in the acknowledgements here, scholars both here and elsewhere whose work has been foundational to the making of this book. But I also do want to invoke here three figures who have meant a great deal to me in this domain of literature, of translation, of what it means to live among many languages. I seem to be rabbiting on only in one language, but I'll try and correct that as we go along. First and foremost, I would like to thank the spirit of Shamsur Rahman Farooqi. Farooqi Saab's work was foundational in many, many ways. Also, in terms of, you all know this already, in terms of organizing a very positive and redemptive, if you will, revision of the tradition of Urdu criticism. And his work, particularly on Mir, the Sher Shorangez, stands as a foundation for any of us who more modestly muddle along and try to work with Mir. I would also like to thank Tom Alter, who was a friend to Athar Saab and to me. And it was from Tom really that in many ways he acted in several plays that I wrote. We exchanged notes, and it always struck me that this was an incredible sensibility. He always felt that, privately he would say that he really didn't want to go on playing the textbook British official of the Raj, and that Urdu was really much more his natural language, and so it was. And I'd also like to think here of Keki Daruwala, who left us a few days ago. As an Anglophone poet, Keki is part of my particular literary tradition. And what I cherished about Keki is that he always saw himself as a multilingual person. He would quote, he grew up in Lahore and Ludhiana, and Urdu and Punjabi were very real to him. He translated as part of his poetic practice. And this is something that I would see to be a legacy for my generation of poets in India who write in Angrezi. So, meanwhile, I'm going to now, I have 40 minutes, of which I've probably used up 10. I'm going to keep this brief. This will be to give you a roadmap of what I hope to do before we go into the conversation. और मेरा हमेशा ये बिल्कुल नेक इरादा रहता है कि I arrive with a typescript, everything duly done, but what really happens is that I create a mapping like this, and then I wing it, but I hope that you'll indulge me in this. So I thought that part one of what I have to share will be my journey to Mir. Because often people have asked me, why Mir? Why not someone better known? Why not become the 2000th person to work on Ghalib, for instance, which also I've done, by the way. That's another story. That'll be part one, the journey to Mir. Part two will be learning from Mir. Because to me, translation is not an act of mastery. I'm actually rather particular in this stance. I feel that translation is always an act of learning, of apprenticeship. You're always the murid. There is something in the language, I'm not being overly mystical here, but there's something within the language that is actually the murshid, and it's murid, and you devote yourself. And it's in that spirit of devotion and dedication that ideally you should do what you do as a translator, not in the spirit of mastering the source language. So I'll say a few things about what I've learned from Mir, and then I'll end with a brief sense of what goes on in the book. So my journey eventually to Mir, but really into the world of Urdu, came about from having grown up in a multilingual family, whose various branches were multilingual in different ways. But for some of it, it's something you begin to cherish and appreciate only when you're much older. You really take this for granted when you're a child. I'm ashamed to say, for instance, that I used to go into gales of laughter when my Hyderabad cousins used to speak Dakhani, which was one of their languages. I thought this was a hoot. Today I realize that, Dakhani represents a very special and in many ways an earlier phase in the journey of Urdu. And if you listen to it, it has a lot to tell you. I was also really grateful. I am grateful in retrospect to have grown up with cousins here in Delhi, cousins in the Air Force who all spoke a very proper Hindustani as one of their languages. So early on, there were inoculations, if you will, against Bombay, which, as it happens, I'm not a great fan of, which also I now see as possibly, scholars have argued, a form of Dakhani. So to me, it was Ghalib who was always the first presence, because my mother was a great fan of his poetry. She recited it, she read it. I, as a child, of course, was baffled by all these efforts and the multiple efforts, but its sonic value, the mellifluity, the sharpness that came in, all of this just stayed with me. It was part of my training, in a way, as a poet. And then at some point in the late 1990s, I became rather focused once again on Ghalib as a historical figure. I was working on a poem which eventually was published as Ghalib in the winter of the Great Revolt. And I became fascinated by the nature of his work and the extreme Persianate nature of his work, but also as, what does it mean for a poet to be a survivor? What does it mean for him to be a political figure? What does it mean for him to navigate between a collapsing empire on the one hand and a rising empire on the other? All of this led me to a great deal of research into Ghalib's work. And it was somewhere along that journey that I came upon Mir in a strange way. Ghalib is, as we all know, incredibly available to us because he's so much closer to us in some ways in time. He's present to us. There's a photograph of Ghalib. There is no real proper likeness of Mir. Ghalib is everywhere in popular culture, in the movies, on stage. Mir, until quite recently, not so prominent. And I was struck by the fact that Ghalib, who, as you know, didn't think terribly highly of any other poet, thought highly of Mir. He says, "Rekhte ke tum hi ustad nahi ho Ghalib, kehte hain agle zamane mein koi Mir bhi tha." We all know this. In my rather irreverent translation, it's something like, "Ghalib, tough luck, you're not the only game in town. They say there used to be some guy called Mir." So I went in search of some guy called Mir. And of course, did all the due diligence down the salt mines that many of us here have done if we are coming to Urdu. All of the Ralph Russell and the Francis Pritchett and the whole bibliography. But what I was greatly struck by in my reading of Mir, why Mir captivated me, is that his language was so incredibly different from Mir's language. This also, we all know, from Ghalib's language. Ghalib is writing at one end of the spectrum, if you will. His language is highly Persianate. He, in fact, saw himself as a Farsi poet who did people the favor of writing in Urdu every now and again. But it's amazing that we remember him really until Meher Afshan Farooqi's recent work. It was his Urdu canon, it's his Divan in Urdu that captivates us. But in Mir, what I immediately fell in love with was the way in which it was lively, it was hybrid. He did not have complex izafats, for one thing, which was a bit of a relief. He in fact even mocks Persian in some verses. I'll read one of them as we go along. But importantly, this is someone who is responding very strongly to Braj, to Avadi, to Khariboli, all of these languages of the Gangetic region are apparent in his work, in his writing, in the way in which he shapes his language. And the registers are incredible. He's not always in a stately, melancholic kind of attitude to the world. He mocks himself, he's self-ironic, he's grim, he's pensive, he can be joyous, he can be obscene. This is what Athar Sahib was talking about. The third part of the Zikr-e Mir, as many of you know, which has long been suppressed and is now coming to light, is actually a series of ribald anecdotes and risque jokes. And it's amazing to think that the same sensibility could have lamented the collapse of an empire, made its own way, and yet found joy in this kind of rather off-color humor. So all of this struck me as a journey into what Urdu really means. And to me, this was crucial because translation to me is a political act. It could be an academic practice. It can, of course, bring aesthetic joy, but for me, above all, almost, it's a political act. And in this case, it had to do with the fact that there's no need to labor this point, we all know it. There is a certain claim being made by very powerful, very dominant
divisive forces, that Urdu is to be identified only with a particular religion. Yet more outlandish claims are made to the effect that it's somehow a foreign language. And there is, from at least 1858 onwards, as part of the aftermath of the Great Revolt, there's been a parting of ways between a more self-consciously Sanskritic, Khadi Boli-based Hindi, from which we get our standard official Hindi, and Urdu that then becomes equally self-consciously Persianized, if you will. What I've tried to do also in the introduction here is to think back to a time when a poet like Mir was able to deal with all of these resources. Remember that he was born in Agra. He grew up hearing Braj and Avadhi. Comes then many vicissitudes later, he comes here to this imperial city, becomes part of another kind of culture, is forced into exile multiple times during the various invasions that are visited upon Delhi. He goes to the Jat strongholds of Deeg, of Kumher, comes back, ends his days in Lucknow. So here is someone who's clearly attentive to a whole range of different languages. So part of what I was impelled to do in writing this book was also to think through a productive counterpoint between Farsi on the one hand, and what I'm thinking of really is the Hindavi continuum. Because this idea that there is one standard Hindi and that all other languages that go into it are dialects is absurd. It's not tenable. And I'm allergic to that word, dialect, because it leads us to diminish languages like Braj or Bhojpuri or Avadhi or Magahi. All kinds of, there are 18 or 19 languages that have been in this way diminished to the status of dialect, although they have very rich, as we all know, traditions of song, of story, of a presence in scribal culture as well as oral culture. So what was this sensibility of Mir's like in the way in which he responded to all of these languages, all their impulses, and also had one foot in Farsi? It also is an occasion for us to reclaim Farsi, because thanks to the habits of the ideology of the nation state, we now tend to think of languages as somehow linked to nation states. So we too often think of Persian as just the national language of Iran as it is today. Many Iranians like to think that too. But the fact is that I've argued here that we should really think in terms of a much larger Iranosphere, which extends across Central Asia, West Asia, and us here, South Asia, where Farsi was really, in the 18th century when Mir was writing, Farsi was an Indian language. There was certainly much more of it being written and published here than in Qajar, Iran. So these are also things these are timelines we probably need to keep in mind. So this is also a way in which, for me, I would like these questions of Indian literature to be seen in more ecumenical ways, in a larger, if you will, pan-Asian context, to think about writers, saints, merchants, rulers, all kinds of people who were circulating across these countries and were bound together in a cosmopolis, to use the term Sheldon Pollock uses for Sanskrit. And as I was reading more and more of Mir and bearing witness to his work, it struck me that I was seeing him as a figure in a landscape. I'd always been fascinated by the history of your great city. And it occurred to me that in mapping his poetry, unfortunately it's not chronological. We know that the 6 volumes of the Kulliyat are not arranged chronologically. There's a completely different ordering principle at work. So we may not really know, unless we look at extant manuscripts, what was written when. But I then resorted to responding to key words that seemed to leap out. A word like ghurbat, for instance, which could be misery, could be suffering, but distinctly is exile. The word vatan comes up again and again. And it seemed to me that there was really a certain binary between vatan, what does it mean to belong, and ghurbat, what does it mean to be exiled, to be displaced. So here's a man who, as a teenager, is in Delhi right after the Nadir Shah invasion. This marks really a major blow to the Mughal Empire. Muhammad Shah Rangila is diminished. He loses prestige, treasures, his viceroys in Bengal and in Lucknow and in Hyderabad effectively revolt. They stopped sending in taxes. It's the beginning of the end for Delhi, in one sense. So there's that entire narrative that goes on through the life of Mir. For 20 years of Mir's life, Ahmad Shah Abdali has periodic raids against Mughal India. In 1788, a Rohilla chieftain, Abdul Qadir, actually for 3 months takes over the city, humiliates the royal family, blinds the emperor, Shah Alam II. So there's that entire cascade of catastrophes that Mir is responding to, living through and responding to. At the same time, there is another life. Scholars like Catherine Schofield and David Lunn, for instance, or Francesca Orsini, they point this out. There is yet, in the face of all of this, a city going to pieces, there is a liveliness in culture. There are the mehfils, there are the gatherings of Sufis and their acolytes, there are gatherings of poets, there's music, there is new advances in music and dance, for instance. So that part of me, which has the instincts of a historian and a literary critic, was really attentive to all of that. I wanted to see how these poems on a page could be set into this larger life of cultural activities. And it's really there that I began to see why he's such a contemporary to us. He's in fundamental ways a refugee. He's a displaced person. He undergoes the experience of diaspora. Now that is an experience for many of us. Many of us here are relatively more secure, not necessarily. Some inherit histories of diaspora. And the world is full of people who are in states of unimaginable agony and suffering as exiles, as people who've been pushed out of their homelands, who, as we speak here, are being bombarded in what used to be their own country and no longer is. So it seems to me that Mir has a great deal to say to us today in this vein. I'll now move to more specifically what I learned from Mir and why. It seemed to me that as an Anglophone poet who reads across languages, in one sense, it's a slightly selfish aim. It's how do I enrich my language, the language of my poetry, through what I learn from the languages that I translate from, whether it's the Kashmiri of Lal Ded or Urdu. I was fascinated by what I think of as the diaphanous syntax of Urdu. There's a way in which sentences can go into completely different ways because the syntax allows it. The syntax of the language I write in is more linear. How do I push that? How do I apprentice myself to this syntax of Urdu? And in this, again, I think I was fortunate to have inherited, by way of legacy, the presence and the work of figures like A.K. Ramanujan, who was a poet, a cultural anthropologist, and a major translator, but also Agha Shahid Ali, who was an early mentor, who was a poet who did a lot to bring the ghazal to American letters in a certain way, and Dilip Chitre, who was a bilingual poet and straddled languages. So in some ways, I feel guided by these presences in these modest efforts. Also, as a translator, it was important for me to not think about translation under the sign of lack. Because too often we think of translation as if you're doing the source language a favor, to say, you're not present in English, we should get you over into English. I think it's a completely foolish way of thinking about it, if you'll pardon my bluntness. Because there is of course a linguistic structure of power that we're thinking of, but I think it's the wrong attitude. It's not as if great literatures here will suddenly become greater by appearing in English. I think one should think about this in a completely different way. I think certainly for me, it's about sharing the richness of literatures like Urdu or Kashmiri and to bring them into English. It actually upends the power structure in a certain way. Also, as I said a little earlier, when I say translation is a political act, I think it's an act of bearing witness to the poetry itself, to the literature, but also to its once and future readers. I think we're thinking here of a community. We're thinking here of people who can share in this and who, in the simple act of reading poetry such as Mir's, for instance, are brought together into a space of resistance, if you will. It's a way of strengthening ourselves against all the forces who insist that we should remain in our separate linguistic and cultural silos. And I think it's one way in which a polarized present can really be resisted or questioned in any case. And I also want to put this in play, I hope we'll discuss it. I think that rather military metaphor of the source language and the target language really has a tonality of extraction. It's as if we were taking something out, as if from a khazana of some kind, and taking it elsewhere. I think that leads us to not always be attentive to the fact that the target language is not static. It's not sovereign. There is no immutable English into which things are being brought. And for me as a poet and a translator, it's really important that my own English is somehow transformed on impact with the source language. So I'll point to a couple of cases where that in fact happens here. How does the target language get transformed, pulled out of shape, pulled into new shapes? That would be an important concern for me. Along the way, also I do hope you'll all read the book, I also had moments of deep sorrow and despair at thinking about the suffering and the endurance of well, I have to say, fellow Indians of previous centuries. I've never thought of myself as a nationalist, but there was a tremendous sense of participating in what has gone before, especially when you think about poets, writers like Mir, Soda, others who were involved in, as victims, involved in the Hangama-e-Abdali, the invasions of Abdali, the shattering of that world, and how they responded. How they responded, for instance, by taking a genre like Shehra Shob. And it begins, as many of you know, as a way of celebrating the excitements of the city. But by the time all of this suffering has been undergone, it's acquired a very different tonality. It is a deep outpouring of grief at the city that's been destroyed, at the way of life that's being destroyed. I was also thinking along the way of how people like Ghalib and Mir were so incredibly precarious. It's both of them took great pride. In fact, they sometimes overcompensated and inflated their ancestral claims. Ghalib always very particular about being a Mirza, an Amirzai of Taimur's clan, and would go to impossible and sometimes self-defeating extremes to uphold his status, even while lacking patronage, seeking patronage. With Mir, it's the same scenario. Some decades earlier, you find that he's proud of his Hijazi descent, sees himself as a Sayyid, but again, across his long life, it's a constant passage from one patron to another. So in a way, it was also for me a journey into looking at, if you will, the political economy that these poets inhabited. That we prize them for their aesthetic gifts, but they also lived in times of uncertainty and stress and were participants in these larger collective struggles. And so this now brings me, I'll conclude my part of this with sharing some of these poems. And I chose to translate ashar rather than entire ghazals because it seemed to me that the structure of expectation and suspense that makes the ghazal work in Urdu, in the oral tradition, falls somewhat flat in printed English. Because there's a particular logic of the refrain that keeps it going. You're looking for what comes next, to greet it either with a wah-wah or an ah. When it's all thrown away on the printed page in translation, it is what it is, and it's also centrifugal. Mind as such doesn't have an unfolding logic. When you come to a translation of a ghazal as particularly an English reader trained in the pieties of modernism, you tend to wonder why each verse is flying off in a different direction. And I've struggled with that over the years, and at least for now, my argument is let's stay with the individual sher, which is the Bait, which is the home. And in any case, it's really the Sher which is seen as the unit of poetry in Urdu. That's the poem. So for me, the spirit in which I put these poems together was in the spirit of someone creating a bayaz. I mean, we know that Urdu poetry exists in different textual forms. You know, it could be the kulliyat, the complete, absolute collected works of the poet. It could be an intikhab, a selection. But it could simply be a poetry lover's bayaz, a notebook in which you put down your favorite verses. So this is what it is. I'm going to share a few poems. How am I doing for time? Okay. I'll try and indicate some of this kaleidoscopic versatility of the poet. This is the poem that really opens this book. Shair ho, mat chup ke raho, ab chup mein jaane jati hain. बात करो, अब्यात पढ़ो, कुछ बैतें हमको बताते रहो. You're a poet. Don't be silent. Lives are lost under cover of silence. Speak up. Read a couple of lines. Read us verses. Keep talking to us. You know, normally I'm a great fan of saying, forget about what's lost in translation. Let's see what's gained. But in this case, something is lost, and it is this. As you all know, a sher is also known as a bait, which is the home in a certain way. And in the second line of this sher, interestingly, Mir uses both a more elevated Persianate plural, abyat, but also a more demotic Hindi style, baitain. That is not very easy to convey into English. But I leave it there for you to think about and to laugh at me. The next one, deeper in the book. क्या जानूं लोग कहते हैं किसको सुरूर कल्ब, आया नहीं ये लफ्ज़ तो हिंदी ज़ुबान के बीच. How would I know what folks call the heart's pleasance? That posh word hasn't made its way into Hindi yet. This for me is one of those cases where he's mocking himself in a certain way. Mir wants to play the rustic who says, how do I know what this Persian stuff is? I'm just a man of the soil and the people. And interestingly, he refers to his language as Hindi. Remember that in his time, no one used that word Urdu at all. Urdu, as Farooqi Sahib reminds us, really is used for the first time for this language in 1780. Up to that point, it's been called Rekhta, Hindi, Hindavi. The word Urdu has much earlier been a synonym for Persian. So half the time when we are involving ourselves in fairly futile language politics for bad identity reasons, we're not really consulting the histories in which these names have a place and how they've mutated over time and what they've meant to different people. Also, one of the things I tried to do here was to share my fascination with the incredibly multilingual figures of this period. Shah Alam II, for instance, completely luckless emperor who gets blinded, who's there for 30 years on the throne, but is barely a throne. But this is a man who's at home in Braj. He writes in Braj. David Lunn is translating his poetry. He speaks Punjabi. He studied Sanskrit. Look where you will. Mir's own half, his step-uncle, Sirajuddin Khan-e-Arzu, is a philologist who's comparing Sanskrit and Persian. These are histories we need to reclaim instead of simply falling down in despair when we're told that, we need to focus on differences. धूप में जलती हैं गुर्बत वतनों की लाशें, तेरे कूचे में मगर साया ए दीवार न था. The sun burns up the corpses of those driven from their homeland. Your lane did not offer them even the shadow of a wall. कर खौफ कलक खस्प की जो सुर्ख हैं आंखें, जलते हैं तरो खुश्क भी मिस्कीन के गज़ब में. Somewhat leftist, if you will, strain in the great poet. Fear those who huddle around fires, their eyes red, both wet and dry will burn in the rage of the oppressed. Miskeen can mean many things. Someone pushed to the margin, someone unfortunate, dispossessed, but also oppressed. हम भी इस शहर में उन लोगों से है खाने खराब मीर घर बार जिन्हों के राह सैलाब में है. I too am one of those people in this city whose homes have been trashed, Mir, whose everything lies in the flood's path. And this is the शेर that gives the book its title. एक जगह पर जैसे भंवर है लेकिन चक्कर रहता है, यानी वतन दरिया है उसमें चार तरफ है सफर में हब. यानी वतन दरिया है उसमें चार तरफ है सफर में अब. Like the whirlpool, still center of a giddy circling, the homeland's an ocean that scatters us in all directions. Thank God for Urdu polysemy, because darya can be ocean, serves my purposes here. It's a river elsewhere, works perfectly well there too. And this is probably one of my favorite ones. बातें हमारी याद रहें, फिर बातें ऐसी न सुनिएगा, पढ़ते किसी को सुनिएगा तो देर तलक सर धुनिएगा. बिल्कुल. Remember my words. You won't hear such words after I'm gone. You'll hear someone else read them and keep beating your head. I make much play with this in terms of where Mir is to be placed in terms of the transition from the oral and the scribal to print, because he died a year before his Kulliyat appeared in print. The industrious British colleagues at Fort William College published his Kulliyat in 1811. He died in 1810, so he never really saw himself in print. But I find this very interesting, because in some sense he's summoning us into the utterance. That's the real thing, right? Baatein hamari yaad rahein. And then he says, if you hear someone read it, that might be a secondary experience. You will miss me. You will miss me is basically his line. He keeps saying it in different ways. This might speak directly to the heart of the present, not to make him a spokesperson for liberal attitudes now, but there's certainly a very strong strain in his thinking. He didn't leave behind a philosophical thesis, but you can glean that from the verses. उसके फ़रोग़ हुस्न से झमके हैं सब में नूर, शमे हरम हो या हो दिया सोमनाथ का. Its splendid beauty sets all things shimmering with light, whether it's the lantern of the Kaaba or the lamp of Somnath. It's incredible how he fixes on Somnath as his focal point. It becomes the focal point for very different kinds of people later, which is why we need to recall this. And I'll end with two other verses. मेरे तगीर हाल पर मत जा, इत्तेफाकात हैं ज़माने के. Here's where I take a little bit of a liberty. Don't go by how things have panned out for me. Stuff happens. And at the end, है मुश्ते खाक लेकिन जो कुछ है मीर हम हैं, मकदूर से ज़्यादा मकदूर है हमारा. We're a handful of dust, but whatever we are, Mir, we are. Greater than the power fate granted us is our power. And I'll close there with the thought that I share. Hopefully someone else will take it forward. That again, I'm amazed by how this verse, for instance, really points far ahead to Iqbal's idea of khudi, and how Iqbal sets himself up as, how is the human individual to express agency, especially against the will of the divine. These are genealogies that we might want to look at closely. Philosophy that's expressed through poetry is still philosophy. Thank you all for your attention. You've been very kind.
जी हजरात, इस खूबसूरत शाम को और आगे बढ़ाएं. होस्कोटे साहब ने मीर का जो जुज़ है, मीर का जो कलाम और उसकी खूबसूरती है, उसका एक बहुत अच्छे अंदाज में उसको पेश किया है. बहुत सारी बातें उसमें आई हैं. मैं समझता हूँ कि वो जिन लोगों को मीर से जिनका रिश्ता है वो उसको अच्छी तरह समझ गए होंगे, लेकिन बहुत सारी बातें हैं जो दिल को कुरेदती हैं कि इसके आगे भी कुछ होगा, इसके आगे भी कुछ हमको समझना है, कुछ हमको सुनना है। और इसलिए अब हमारी कोशिश होगी कि कुछ मिनटों में हम शायद आधा घंटा हमको मिला है, आधे घंटे में कुछ दिल में जो सवाल आ रहे हैं उनको आपके सामने पेश करें। और एक बात मैं वाज़ेह कर दूं कि हमने इसको वेबसाइट पे डाला था कि ये प्रोग्राम होगा और आप यहाँ पर आ रहे हैं। बहुत सारे सवाल लोगों ने भेजे इस उम्मीद में कि उनको कहीं कुछ जवाब उसके मिल जाएंगे, तो उन सवालों की भी हम कोशिश कर रहे हैं कि वो एक फहरिस्त है, उसको भी हम आपसे जब बात करें तो उसको भी हम पूछते रहें। बहुत सारे आपके चाहने वाले, मीर के चाहने वाले, और उनके दिल के अंदर बहुत सारे वो जज्बात, वो तासुरात जिनको उन्होंने पेश करने की कोशिश करी है, वो सवाल भी हम आपके साथ इस गुफ्तगू में रखेंगे। माज़रत मैं इस बात की चाहता हूँ कि मकसद हमारा उर्दू घर का ये सिर्फ़ नहीं है कि हम उर्दू तक ही अपने आप को कायम रखें, उर्दू से आगे बढ़कर उर्दू के और जो रिश्ते हैं उनको भी हम नुमाया करें। और उसमें जैसे फ़ारूक साहब ने कहा, उसमें हिंदुस्तान की एक ज़बान अंग्रेज़ी भी है और इसलिए अंग्रेज़ी से भी हम लोगों को वाबस्तगी है। तो बहुत सारे जो सवाल हैं वो शायद जहाँ होस्कोटे साहब चाहेंगे कि हम फिर से उसको वापस उर्दू की तरफ ले चलें तो उर्दू की तरफ चलेंगे, लेकिन अंग्रेज़ी में बहुत सारे सवाल आए थे, उनको हमने जमा किया है और वो सवाल आपसे हम पेश करेंगे। माज़रत चाहता हूँ कि आप ये तवक्को ना करें कि ये सारे सवाल उर्दू में हों और उर्दू में ही उनके जवाब भी मिल जाएं, लेकिन उम्मीद पे दुनिया ज़िंदा है और आगे कुछ भी मुमकिन है। और आज के ज़माने में हिंदुस्तान में कहा जाता है कि फ़लाँ फ़लाँ है तो मुमकिन है, तो इसलिए अगर होस्कोटे साहब यहाँ हैं तो यकीनन कुछ भी मुमकिन है। मुमकिन है कि वो अंग्रेज़ी के सवालों का जवाब उर्दू में दे दें और मुमकिन है कि उर्दू के सवालों का जवाब वो अंग्रेज़ी में दे दें। तो चलिए इस सवालात के मामले को आगे बढ़ाते हैं। And the first question that we have culled out of all the suggestions that came is that, and you have, everything that's come here is available in the book. The phraseology, the expression, the intent, the direction is all available in the book. But if you have the person who wrote the book in front of you, the book can take a back seat and be read later. But the important fact is that the appellations that you have also used of Khuda-e Sukhan, used for Mir Taqi Mir, and you've exposed the various genres to which he traversed, including the ghazal, the qasida, masnavi, rubai, through his remarkable literary journey. You think you'd want to say something a little more about the enormous kind of expanse of genres that he utilized?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it takes us back to a time in literary practice where poets were not, or writers at large, were not narrowly specialized. And they were also responding to different kinds of claims on their time and attention. So with the same poet, with Mir, you find that he is producing qasidas, for instance. They might be odes in praise of a patron. He might have much longer poetic cycles. The ghazals are possibly his, more close to the core of his expression. And then there's the Zikr-e Mir, which I find extremely fascinating, at least partly because it's often thought of as, it's been described as the first autobiography by an Urdu poet, although it's actually in Farsi. But A scholar like Zara Sabri, for instance, has pointed out more recently that maybe we should look at it in a different way, that it continues another kind of practice, that of bringing together a miscellany. Because, as you know, the three parts of it. The first part is essentially, it's in praise of his father. He's setting up his father as a Sufi. There doesn't seem to be much empirical evidence of this, but to him, it builds him into a certain lineage. The second part has much more in common with the Shahr Ashub. It's a reflection on the destruction of Delhi. The third part is that collection of off-color jokes and stories. So I would focus on the Zikr-e Mir in response to this question, because it allows us to think about a poet or writer who's not constrained immediately by questions of genre, of what might happen in a different kind of publishing context. I think we need to go back from print modernity to think about what this other modernity was like.
You speak of these three sections or segments. You did mention in passing the third one, which obviously I think sadly was censored out or redacted, etc. And that's, some people treat that as a historical wrong, a literary historical wrong. It's now, of course, available.
Yes.
It's now available to us. But what does that do? Does that give us gives us a wrong impression about the man, the totality of the person that he was? Or when it does appear finally in print, in translation, first only in English and then finally in Urdu,
that's right.
Does that change one's understanding and perception of me?
I think to take a line from someone who was, in fact, more or less the near contemporary of Ghalib and of Mir, Walt Whitman, we have to accept that we contain multitudes. So to me, it's a way of thinking in a more expansive way of a poet's oeuvre. And it's also a way in which our own assumptions are challenged. I think we become aware of the extent to which our aesthetic, our responses are, so to speak, Puritan. They've been shaped by a certain kind of pedagogy.
Okay.
And it takes us back to a kind of a primal scene, if you will, where there is a very dominant, I have to say, Anglican way of looking at the world, which describes, it kind of defines pedagogy, it defines what gets published. And from that kind of eye, in the 1850s, 60s, 1870s, so much that goes on in Indian literature seems obscene, off-color, strange. I think we need to revisit possibly the xenophobia that we've imbibed as a result of a certain kind of colonial pedagogy. I think that's the challenge
That's understandable. But the section that was redacted, or the section that was censored, didn't just have jokes and ribald jokes, etc. But it also had something more serious in terms of attitudes towards homosexuality.
Yes, indeed.
Something that was obviously completely taboo,
Exactly.
at least in conversations till the Victorian times and
right.
even later. What does that bring out for us?
I think it invites us to look at this moment in Mughal society or in Indian history as having perhaps been far more capacious in its attitudes towards sexual preference, towards how people identified themselves. And that would invite us to rethink and rewrite that part of history.
But are there any references of his contemporaries to any of this material, or?
I think it does appear in a number of places.
It does.
Not, I don't have them immediately at my
Okay.
fingertips, but
Okay.
but it's certainly
Yeah.
well known, and it certainly was seen as a source of if you will, moral contamination.
Right. Thank you. Now, you recited the Sher of Ghalib about Mir, Rikhta ke tu hi nahi ustad ho Ghalib, अगले ज़माने में कोई मीर भी था. So as far as modern scholarship is concerned, indeed our association with Urdu poetry is concerned, we find that perhaps I won't be wrong in saying that for a variety of reasons, Ghalib does eclipse Mir somewhat. And you have to go then and rediscover Mir, which is what's been happening in the last few months, etc. So what was this reason? Why is Mir perceived in the way that Mir is perceived in Ghalib? For what reasons was Ghalib more accessible, more part of our approach to literature and to poetry and art and to shairi?
At least three different reasons. One of which is that Ghalib lived in the age of print modernity. He was able to edit and oversee the publication of at least 5 editions of his divan. So he exercised editorial control on what was put out, how it was seen. There was also very strong, already from his lifetime onwards, through his letters to his friends and his disciples, we know this, there was a very strong commentatorial tradition for Ghalib, which was already in place. It began while he was alive and continued very strongly. It was a tradition of commentators who were able to deal with the specificities of his work. I think what might have happened to Mir, in fact this is certainly true, is that he may have been killed with praise of the wrong kind. I think that particularly this appellation, Khudai Sukhan, for instance, the god of poetry. Now, once you've enthroned somebody like that, there's no further critical engagement. And I think through particularly influential critics who emerge in the aftermath of the 1850s, Azad, Hali, there's a way in which Mir is portrayed as, through cliche, I have to say, unfortunately. I'm not saying this. Farooqi Saab pointed that out already before any of us. He's presented as the poet of unrequited love, the poet of sorrow, etc. And then you see the evidence of the poetry. There's so much more that exceeds that. So I think it's just also the way in which a certain image of a poet and his poetry gets perpetuated. And it's just taken to be gospel until you can read against the grain. Also, it's just the sheer presence of Ghalib in popular culture, as I was saying earlier. Yeah, and the Hindi movies and their music.
I was going to come to that in a moment, but both of them, Mir and Ghalib, had intense experiences of tragic things happening.
Indeed.
On a mass scale. I mean, there was Ahmad Shah Abdali and Nadir Shah for Mir. There was 1857 for Ghalib, etc. But the pathos and tragedy in Ghalib's life seems more apparent and more intense for modern readers than it does for Mir. Mir is a historical sort of fact. Is that something to do with the way they responded in their poetry, or is it something quite different?
I think you'd agree if I suggested that has to do with why 1857 is a far more traumatic and present event to us. I keep saying us, I no longer know who that us is. I think it might be a certain generation, a certain kind of sensibility, but 1857 is certainly a watershed moment of a certain kind. It really represents the destruction of the Mughal Empire, the passing of power to the crown, and really the beginning of a certain period of colonization proper. And all this is more real to us. It's present to us through photography, through writing. It's just more viscerally present. Whilst it's strange, Mir dies in 1810. He's not ancient. But the 18th century is somehow, it gets blurred until recently. Now there's a great deal of scholarship across disciplines, which is wonderful. But I think the 18th century might have been difficult to parse for historians. There was far too much going on there which didn't fit too neatly into a nationalist account, nor did it fit clearly into an imperialist account. If you look at all of these people, for instance, all the way to Ghalib, in fact, they are living at the cusp of different cultures coming together. Not only the North, but the whole of India has all kinds of unexpected, unpredictable encounters among people of European origin, people of Indian origin, people coming in from West Asia. There's an enormous cultural efflorescence along with all the chaos that's going on. And I think for all of these reasons, the 18th century has posed a challenge to a certain kind of history writing.
Okay.
Also, sources have been hidden in the original language or in libraries that people can't access. More and more of that is happening now. So we see that whole period in its richness and its plenitude.
Okay. You just mentioned something about popular cinema, and that also had some role. And what would be the reason that had some role? I mean, I tried to look at popular cinema to see if Mir figured anywhere, and I find that it's in the film on Ghalib, that Ghalib encounters this American the singer singing something from Patta Patta Buta Buta Hala Mara Jane hai, and that's when Ghalib then recites that phrase about Rekhta, etc. Right. So is this just coincidence that the cinema just took what was the background that you've just given us, or was there something else that appealed to cinema in a manner in which the treatment varied and differed?
This is, I think this is paradoxical, but I'm quite sure specialists in Hindi and non-Indian cinema have worked on this. It may be that there was a moment in the Indian cinema, say between the 30s and the 60s, when there was a sense of a ceremonial celebration of the Mughal period. And the writers who came in, so many of the Urdu writers, we know this, the progressive writers were part of this story. They may have inclined towards a more Persianate, a more musically, if you will, friendly kind of register. And this is where Ghalib, even though the words, I mean, you listen to these lyrics and think, who on God's earth would have really grasped all of what's going on there? Because there are complex, intellectually complex ideas. And Mir, who in one sense is set up for popularity, is fairly direct. He's using language that's still current. It's not elevated elite diction. Gets left out of the record in a strange way. So I don't really have an answer to that, just confronting the fact that Ghalib then becomes this larger-than-life figure and gains this afterlife in
Perhaps
cinema.
somebody should make a film on Mir and maybe put that right. Now, there were questions about the global context, the poetry in the world in the times of Mir and poetry in the times of Ghalib. I mean, for instance, Goethe, Blake, Wordsworth for Mir, and Hine, Shelley, Whitman, etc. for Ghalib. Is that relevant in any way for our true understanding of these two poets?
No, I use that as a device, really. Clearly, it's unlikely. I mean, Goethe and some of his compatriots, of course, knew of classical Sanskrit poetry, but I don't know the extent to which they were aware of Urdu poetry and the other way around. The reason I use those timelines as a device in the introduction is because far too often, maybe as partly a result of this 18th century being seen as some kind of time warp, there's a tendency to see Urdu poetry as something out there and back then, without engaging with what exactly is back then and when is it. So it's a bit of a shock tactic when you say, you know what, these poets were writing at the same time that Baudelaire was writing, or Whitman, or Heine.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean that there was any contact among them. It's just to say that if you can accord the status of the modern to a Baudelaire in The Great City, to a Heine who's making sense of the patchwork state of Germany, or Whitman who's creating a whole new inclusive, to a certain extent, national myth of America, why are we looking at Ghalib and Mir as strange figures in a strange language? They too were involved in large-scale dramas, which should be relevant to us because the Mughal Empire was a major presence on the map. And right. It's also for me a way of saying that we need to take greater, modest, and apprentice-like ownership of these histories. We keep saying that we should be proud to be Indian, and then we go back to imaginary pasts to invest with that pride. There really are far more proximate things to be proud of.
Quite right. Okay. Let's come closer home a bit and you mention his uncle Khani Arzu, and also the life of Khani Arzu and events that shaped circumstances for him, brought in that the Shia Sunni divide in the family, and presumably in Lucknow and wherever else they were. Did that play a major role in his understanding of humanity, of Mir's understanding of humanity?
That's actually a question that I've been preoccupied by, but did not feel ready enough to take on in this introduction. But it's very clear that the breach with Khani Arzu comes about as a result of Mir formally presenting himself as Shia. The narratives about family scandals and so on and so forth. But I think that this is the rock on which the relationship founded. But once again, I think to myself, maybe this identification with the dispossessed, the innocent victim, one has to look for traces. A number of these ideas, these tropes, these figures come out of a certain sheer sense of radical injustice and the need to oppose it. But I would have to read much more and bring that evidence together.
Okay, so when we speak of the relationship between Shias and Sunnis, the relationship between Delhi and Lucknow becomes quite apparent. We understand from what you've written that Mir abhorred Lucknow and loved Delhi, but circumstances forced him, as it did others, to move to Lucknow and make his living in Lucknow. How does that influence his poetry? How does it influence his attitudes, etc.? The fact that he had to move to a city that he abhorred.
Again, as we said, because the chronology is not immediately apparent, but wherever he actively and clearly refers to Lucknow, it's always pessimistic. It's always, he's just simply not in tune with the city. And I think for somebody like him, and it happened, Sauda had moved as well. Khani Arzu himself had moved to Awadh and then eventually to Lucknow proper. But this was really a result of the shift of power and patronage. Again, when you look at the long 18th century, you're looking at a complete shift in the center of gravity. It moves out to the people who had been Mughal viceroys. Nawab is really the plural of Naib. We know this, right? The lieutenants who are now rulers in their own right, whether that was Awadh or Bengal or Hyderabad. These were the rulers who are now able to offer just basic security, for one thing. They were not exposed to attacks from the northwest. They were being themselves rebels of a certain kind, although camouflaged. They had a greater sense of their authority, and they attracted talent, mercantile talent, artistic talent. They were also setting up their own relationship to the rising East India Company, which eventually would swallow them all, but not yet at this point. So you're looking here at these glittering new hubs. But for me, I think there was always this sense, as I said, the tension in his poetry between Vatan and Gurbat. There was no way in which he could shift his allegiances. And he was an old man already. I think the sense of belonging to Delhi was very, very strong. So I've used a term that comes straight out of contemporary ecological thinking, solastalgia, to describe what his state of mind was. It wasn't nostalgia. He wasn't bemoaning things lost in the past. He was lamenting a present that was falling apart around him. And so he became a very reluctant migrant. And then for that we have the evidence of the Abe Hayat, the stories about how he didn't quite fit into Lucknow. From his very first appearance in very ornate Mughal court attire, which got laughed at by all the young talent in their new costumes. And that story is sometimes played for laughs. You know, this man showing up in his elaborate court sword and his dagger and his pointy shoes, and you want to think, this is very unfunny. It's someone who's trying to carry his broken life world with him to another place. And wherever you look today in the world, we are looking at people like that. People who are trying to carry shards of their own life world to new homes that may or may not be hospitable every day. Open the newspapers, these are the stories we read, which I think is why he is an exalted poet at one level, but he's really a figure of the present.
That's an interesting lesson for migrants of our times. You've touched upon Hindavi continuum, Rekhta, Hindi, Urdu. What was said then was to be Hindi, but it was a different Hindi from the Hindi that we know. So, would you like to say a few words about this continuum? But how Hindi becomes Urdu, Urdu becomes Hindi, and yet it's not Hindi or Urdu, etc.
Brutally summarized in the introduction,
Yeah.
but this really comes about from just thinking about how a certain kind of linguistic oppression has been visited on this continuum of languages, which in strange ways unites very different regions. It extends really from Rajasthan to the eastern edges of the Doab, and from the Shivaliks to Telangana. I emphasize this Telangana part of it because part of my story is also about the last, not quite the last, it's hidden in plain sight, the Dakhani inheritance, which from early on in the 18th century is really part of what Urdu or Hindavi or Hindi poets in Delhi are taking on board. But they're not willing to acknowledge it. Mir doesn't acknowledge it. He takes it on board, but he doesn't acknowledge that. So, for me, it's also a way of thinking through these rich networks of languages, each independent but related to the other. So what were these osmotic connections among languages, which today have gone under the linguistic radar in a certain way? And we invest this word Urdu with whatever images come to us. For some of us, it's precisely the language of the 1960s Hindi cinema, elevated, marvelous fantasy world. For others, clearly, it's a word that evokes fear. This is alien, this is from somewhere else. But if you go back to the history, in the very first usage, it's simply Zuba-e Urdu e Muala-e Shahjahanabad, which is Persian.
Okay, yeah.
Early on, for a decade or two. Then it comes to mean something else. The word falls away from usage. Shah Alam would simply think of his language as Rekhta. Mir thought of it as Hindi. And then at some point in 1780, Urdu becomes the word that identifies it. But it doesn't catch on. It really doesn't catch on. Ghalib never used the word except once or twice in his letters. And there, in at least one place, he gets the gender wrong. He's not quite sure how to parse this word. It's not until the far more standard canonical works of Hali and Azad and the need to... Then we get to an unfortunate phase in South Asian politics, where there's a need to identify communal religious linguistic identities, which tears apart something that has been shared across religious lines. Okay. So we have to see Urdu and Hindi as words that have meant different things at different times.
Okay.
It's one way to, in some sense, defang linguistic politics or communal politics.
Right. Thank you. There are two questions which are somewhat technical, but I think they're important because of your ability as a translator. The issue of the people who love English poetry, I understand, this is one of the questions that came, that the Nasri Nazm or prose poetry is Azad Nazm, free verse, is free verse. And the use of the term free verse very loosely means both. Urdu, both in Azad Nazm, free verse, and Nazm-e Muhara, blank verse, has to have a meter or wazn, right? In Urdu, perhaps it's more difficult to compose Azad Nazm because it is in the same meter, which is broken and is used in different lines. अलग-अलग मिसरों में अलग-अलग इस्तेमाल होता है, whereas in fact while writing in blank verse all lines are in the same meter. In Urdu, Nasri blank verse all lines are the same meter. In Urdu, Nasri Nazm prose poetry doesn't have anything to do with rhythm or meter. Indian English poets perhaps, and please correct me if I'm wrong, use the category of Nasri Nazam prose poetry for Nazme Muhara or blank verse, although this is a question for a classroom. But since it was put to me, I thought I had to pass it on to you and get some technical knowledge.
Blank verse is highly metrical in English, certainly.
Yeah.
But I think what we're looking at here is this question of Professor Bala is looking at me very sharply. But free verse, I've always been troubled by that term, free verse. Free of what is really the question to me as a practicing poet.
Yeah.
I would therefore, at least in my practice, I would veer away from notions of meter or strictness of meter to questions of cadence. In what way what is the musicality of language? How do we play with that? I think these are key questions as a practitioner. Also reminding ourselves that a lot of what we take to be metrically integral to English is actually completely alien to English. It is imported wholesale at a certain point from Greek. So we're very happy to talk about pentameters and hexameters. All of this made great sense in Greek poetry. In English, you have to force fit that in a certain way. And then you bring that back into Urdu. I think we get caught up with questions, for instance, of are we looking at the syllabic count? Are we looking at the length of syllables? What excites me greatly about Mir, for instance, that he's playing constantly with syllable lengths. I found that confusing at first because I was thinking, what is this? Yaha is ya. And how do we go? What is this? Then you realize that he's picking that up really from, and this also has been pointed out by scholars, that comes to him also from Khadi Boli, comes from Braj. To me, the excitement of poetry lies not in how it conforms to some prior notion of prosody, but how it takes that on board and then defies it and transgresses in interesting ways.
Okay. Another technical question refers to Shamsur Rahman Farooqi Saab's work, and you've acknowledged it, of course, and the debt that we all owe to him. Now, his work, Shore Angez, and his translating to and using punctuation or removing punctuation from translations. Now, is that something that figures in your efforts to translate, or I mean, this is a technical thing?
No, happy to respond to that. I have to plead guilty. I have punctuation. While I still speak of the diaphaneity of syntax in Urdu, which doesn't have punctuation, but to me it seemed that, at least for these present purposes, punctuation would be helpful. But in at least 3 books of my own poetry, which have been written under the sign of being an apprentice to this tradition, I've done away with punctuation pretty much completely.
What's the reaction that you get for that? I mean,
on a scale from bafflement to great joy.
Freedom from punctuation. Well, we come to the end of this session, but I want a word from you for young translators, perhaps young poets, as to the things that you believe would be important for them to keep in mind as they move forward in whatever they're doing.
Oh my goodness, I'm terrible at offering advice. But if there's any one thing I would say to you, what does that mean? Young translators? I'm clearly not young anymore. Clearly I'm not young anymore.
That's the discretion that you can give to us to exercise.
I think what I would share as a fellow artisan or practitioner is that sometimes there's a tendency to see the individual poem as your key focus. I think that individual poem really becomes far more fruitful, and that quest becomes fruitful when you place it in multiple contexts. It reveals itself more fully. So I think it's really important to think, it's not necessarily easy to think in terms of a book, but I think it helps if you devote yourself to a body of work rather than individual poetry and see the work in its fullness, and to see what that text might have meant in its own contexts, which means really what I'm saying is that translation must necessarily involve a great degree of research. You have to be able to devote yourself to really researching the life world from which these texts emerge. It's not really just looking for the right word, which is important, but it's also for thinking about how those words might have mutated in their meaning. For instance, what might they have meant to their first listeners? What's the journey that those words have made? So then they just stop being individual word objects and they become part of a larger set of currents.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. And I believe he deserves a standing ovation for...
Oh my gosh, okay.
A wonderful, wonderful conversation. मैं शुक्रगुजार हूँ रंजीत साहब की और सलमान खुर्शीद साहब की कि उन्होंने हमें अपना कीमती वक्त दिया और मीर के बारे में जो भी हमारे में नॉलेज थी उसमें इजाफ़ा किया. थैंक यू सो मच. इसके अलावा मैं शुक्रिया अदा करूँगी IHC की प्रेसिडेंट मिस भास्वती मुखर्जी साहिबा का और IHC के डायरेक्टर सुनीत टंडन साहब का कि उन्होंने हमें IHC में जगह दी ये इवेंट करवाने के लिए. सुनीत टंडन साहब, आप प्लीज़ आके इफ़ यू कुड प्लीज़ से अ फ्यू वर्ड्स.
Good evening. It's such a pleasure to be here on the first time that we, IHC, are hosting Adab Sarai. I mean, apart from the great tricentenary function for Mir, which we had done much earlier in the year. And we look forward to many such wonderful sessions. It's a great pleasure indeed to welcome Ranjit Hoskote and also Salman Khurshid, who's been a very old friend from way back when, to this on this occasion. I am so delighted that you could be here for this wonderful session. Thank you.
Apparently, and
I see.
I think we should be generous now.
Oh, please, please.
Let them
If
ask
you
those
wish.
questions.
So, a few quick questions, perhaps.
Good evening, thank you. It was a lovely session. Just wanted to address the lament with the kind permission of the panelists that Mir has perhaps not been celebrated in popular culture as much as Ghalib. I mean, comparisons are inevitable, but in this case, I believe quality is more important than quantity. And firstly, if you come to ghazals, I think he's been celebrated, Mir has been celebrated in the best, by the best of ghazal singers. Begum Akhtar has sung Ulti Ho Gayi Sab Tadbeerein, Kuch Na Dawa Ne Kaam Kiya. And Mehdi Hasan, of course, has composed and sung Patta Patta Bhuta Bhuta Haal Hamara Jane Hai beautifully. Possibly it was used in a Pakistani film as well. And in Indian films, as we all might remember, there was a film called Ek Nazar, 1972, which was, Amitabh Bachchan was not very well known then. He was a struggler. He and Jaya Bachchan, in fact, sing Patta Patta Bhuta Bhuta. But the most beautiful use of Mir's poetry is in Sagar Sarhadi's Bazaar. Dikhai diye यूं कि खुद बे किया हमें आपसे भी जुदा कर चले. बहुत आरज़ू थी गली की तेरी सो यहाँ से लहू में नहा कर चले. It's beautifully sung by Lata Mangeshkar. So I just wanted to end on this joyous note that Mir has been celebrated in our popular culture and hopefully will be. People will keep rediscovering more of him. Thank you.
Really amazing evening. Thanks, really, and congratulations for this wonderful book. Just on the margins of this, political side of it, just I would this off-color couplet. I will just recite it for this occasion. It's basically from Farooqi Saab's work. मीर कितने सादा हो तुम, बीमार हुए तुम जिसके सबब उसी अतार के लोंडे से दवा लेते थे.
Thank you. So is that it? Thank you very much. Thank you for one more question. Okay.
You have credited Farooqi Sahab for your learning of Mir. Farooqi Sahab was of the opinion that one sher or one ghazal has several meanings. So when you are translating, how do you choose which meaning you have to translate?
Well, that's a choice that one makes. If it's possible to indicate somehow the doubleness of meaning, one should aim for that, but there are linguistic challenges. So what I sometimes do in those cases is to supply a note on the subject. Because, in the original, and there's a whole tradition in the Indian languages of verses that can mean two different things. That's honestly very difficult to convey in a single verse. So there are different strategies. Either you present those different meanings, or you have a footnote. So this is what I meant earlier when I said, what's the advice to translators? I think if you see this as a project that extends beyond just the text itself, then you see that you also have to develop a certain apparatus as a gesture of hospitality into which this text comes. So there are some limitations to what you can achieve as a translator, and this is definitely one of them.
Thank you. There's one there.
Yeah. आपसे दो सवाल पहले तो आपको दिली शुक्रिया अदा करना चाहता हूँ. मैंने कुछ उर्दू शायरी का तर्जुमा भी किया है और मुझे मालूम है कि कितना मुश्किल है. एक बात तो ये है कि पब्लिशर ने आपको ये नहीं दिया कि उर्दू रस्मुल ख़त में भी आए, इसलिए कि जो रोमन उर्दू है मुझे कुछ अच्छा नहीं लगता. खैर, दूसरी बात यह है कि क्या आप मज़ीद शायरी का तर्जुमा करेंगे? मज़ीद शायरी यानी और करेंगे आप मीर की?
I don't know why I'm rabbiting on in English instead of responding in Urdu or in Hindi. Shukriya, आपने जो सवाल किए, एक तो Roman English was used because Roman Urdu was really used from the point of view that some readers would get a sense of what it sounds like. And this is, I think, a discussion that also is prevalent in other series of the classics, where there's a question of who is the book for. If that can also be done. But in this case, I think we went with Romanized Urdu. To me, yes, this is the beginning rather than the end of the Mir journey, which is why I said, जैसे मैंने कहा कि ये बयाज़ है मेरा, तो इस बयाज़ से और भी शायद there'll be more editions of it, I hope. But at least privately, I intend to continue with the journey, because a poet takes hold of your imagination. So for me, it's not just the book as the project. These are lifelong commitments. So I hope at some point to go back again to Mir. And I don't think I ever actually, I meant to share this at the beginning, but I didn't. The way in which I first began to share these translations was on Twitter, which to me at that point seemed like an interesting way of taking on board social media, which I was very skeptical of it. This is where you put up cat videos. But then I thought, maybe if I treat it as a literary medium, what might come of that? So I used to do the Romanized Urdu, my translation, and usually an image, either from Mughal or Rajput or Safavi or Dakhani painting. And it actually became a little focus for a community of scholars and writers, many of whom also had suggestions to make. And I'm saying this because the transactions on the printed page also reflect other kinds of relationships. I'm thinking here of a point made to me by a dear friend, the Lahore-based novelist Lal Ded, who said, think about what sa does. Samp, sa. What is it? Like a snake? Snake-like? Snake-esque? how do you really, I mean, it's a very small, it's just a syllable, but it completely transforms the word, the sentence, the image. I'd always be grateful to that little community of Mir Project people on Twitter. So bringing this back to your question, yes, for me it'll continue to be a commitment. I hope to translate more, and I hope to share more of these translations as we go along. Shukriya. Shukriya.
Shukriya. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Really wonderful.
Thank you, Mr. Hoskote, Mr. Rashid. ये किताब बाहर अवेलेबल है सेल के लिए, आप लोग वो किताब ख़रीद सकते हैं और होस्कोटे साहब से इसको साइन करवा सकते हैं। उसके अलावा अंजुमन का भी स्टॉल है, वहाँ पे भी किताबें हैं उर्दू की, जो अगर आप लेना चाहें तो आप वो भी ख़रीद सकते हैं। उर्दू घर ऐसे कई प्रोग्राम्स करवाता रहता है, उसकी इन्फॉर्मेशन हम आपको मिलेगी हमारे सोशल मीडिया हैंडल से, वेबसाइट से, तो आप हमें यूट्यूब, फेसबुक और इंस्टाग्राम और ट्विटर पे फॉलो कर सकते हैं टू स्टे अप टू डेट विद व्हाट्स कमिंग अप। हमारा नेक्स्ट अदब सराय का सेशन 14 दिसंबर को है, ये रत्ना पाठक शाह के साथ है थिएटर पर, तो वील मीट अगैन देन। और ये भी हैबिटेट में है, स्टाइन ऑडिटोरियम में। शुक्रिया।